Welcome to Focus on Albany. I'm Cynthia Pooler. My guest today is Blair Horner, Executive Director of NYPIRG, and he was kind enough to come on the show today in the midst of such a busy schedule. So, the first thing I want to talk about is what's the problem with the redistricting? Is that going back to the courts?
Well, thanks for having me on your show. It's great seeing you. And this is fun to actually do it via Zoom. So I do get to see you, and you get to see the NYPIRG office behind me.
Uh huh.
Um, uh, yeah, I mean, the not surprisingly, like every other redistricting, these maps have been challenged as unconstitutional. What makes it different this time than any of the other previous litigation is there's a new state constitution that deals with redistricting. And so the lowest court, the Supreme Court that handles this in New York, the Supreme Court is a lower court, or New York State Court of Appeals is the highest court. A judge there out in Western New York reviewed the maps and said that they were undeniably biased against Republicans, and that there were zero, he said, I believe, districts that were competitive, as is um, as is requested, I think, by the state constitution. Now, what happens next? I mean, anyone knows the states appealed that decision. They have received a stay, which means that the judge's order at the lower court level is held for now. And there's going to be a hearing on it Thursday of this week.
So, I want to specifically talk about John McDonald. He was completely redistricted out of Albany. And he was going to have a primary opponent, but the primary opponent lives in Albany, so he couldn't primary McDonald. And I found that very interesting. Will that be in place still? I mean, will he have any recourse to challenge an incumbent at any point, or any challenger, challenge an incumbent?
Well, I mean, without getting too much into all the various details, my understanding is both the Assembly and Senate district lines are were reviewed by the court, as were the congressional lines. So, we don't know what's going to happen on appeal, but there could be new lines drawn, and there could be, as a result, primary elections that get postponed from June. And if the lines are drawn, that could change everything, right? So, the courts will decide what it is they're going to do in terms of whether these were illegally drawn or not. Again, it's hard to predict what's going to happen in the future. But if you're supposed to live in the district in order to run at the state level,
Right.
in Congress, you can run it from outside of the district.
So, will that, you say that might change the primary date?
I mean, who knows, right? I mean, it sort of depends on what happens. But if they decided to change, if the court rules and the appeals process plays out, let's say over the next month, and the court rules that these lines are unconstitutionally biased, how would people that were running for office may not be eligible to run in that district, and people that wanted to run for office were cut out of a district, may want to run for
Mm-hmm.
an office.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the outcomes possibly is that there would be a primary election in August as compared to June. But again, it's hard to predict what's going to happen because it hinges on that first question. Are these maps unconstitutionally biased? The lower court ruled yes. There'll be a hearing this week on how to proceed. And the state has said they're going to appeal. So I assume it would be moved to the Court of Appeals level pretty quickly if that's what happens. And that court then would ultimately have to decide. And what makes this different, as I mentioned earlier, is this is a new system with new provisions in the state constitution. And so the litigation that existed prior to 2014, was probably helpful, depending on how the courts will view this. but not determinative, because there are, again, new provisions that make it different when you're drawing these lines.
Who do you know who ultimately initiated this?
Well, I don't recall off the top of my head, but I believe it was, it was some local person, I think allied with the Republican Party in Western New York, who was
Hmm.
challenging the line, saying that they were unconstitutionally drawn. The lawyer who's handling it is a guy named John Faso, who's a former
Oh.
assembly member and former member of Congress.
Hmm.
And I believe he's the person handling sort of the legal side, this legal challenge. Not surprisingly, the Republicans are not thrilled with the lines, right? Because they're the minority party.
Right. So when it was a majority of Republicans in the Senate over the past couple of decades, was it this contentious?
Well, there was always litigation. Someone would bring litigation because someone doesn't like the lines, right? And there's always an argument to be made. In New York, um, the legislative lines tended, particularly the state senate, tended to be heavily gerrymandered to benefit Republicans. In an increasingly blue state, the only way that they really could survive in the state senate was to draw lines that benefited them politically. The congressional lines were different last time. Um, you know, just so your listeners know, I mean, technically, the way the lines are drawn is both houses of the legislature have to approve a bill. They have to agree on legislation. It goes to the governor for a signature. The Congress is not involved. And so the congressional lines historically had to be negotiated between the two houses. But if the houses are controlled by different political parties, sometimes that doesn't happen. And last time, 10 years ago, the lines were drawn by the courts and because both houses couldn't agree. So the congressional lines are sort of a different beast in terms of looking at it from the currently in terms of litigation, in terms of looking at whether or not the lines are unfair or fair. The state Senate lines were, heavily gerrymandered 10 years ago to benefit Republicans. And so not surprisingly, if Democrats redraw the lines 10 years later, the lines are going to look very different. And that's what happened. So that, again, the court has ruled at the preliminary sort of part of the process that all of those lines were drawn in an unconstitutionally biased way. See what happens.
Wow. So 10 years ago, was it this messy? It,
No, because it was a deal. And there was litigation because there was a challenge, as I recall, to the state Senate lines because there was an argument that was being made that the state Senate lines were drawn to essentially make it harder for uh, communities of color to elect their own representatives into Congress. And so, you know, and that has historically been, there's been challenges, particularly on Long Island, from the way that the lines were drawn. But I don't believe there was litigation, although there might have been over the congressional lines because the courts drew them. And so there may have been federal issues, but it's not it's this different thing when somebody's drawing the lines, which is what we want, somebody drawing the lines that doesn't have a stake in the outcome, which was the case in the congressional lines that were drawn 10 years ago.
um, I find this changing subjects. I find this whole thing with the stadium in Buffalo pretty interesting. Um, that's pretty, from my perspective, it's pretty unethical. What do you think?
Well, we don't know a whole lot about what's going on with that. We do know that Governor Hochul negotiated a deal with the Pagulas, who own the Buffalo Bills, for a new stadium. And the cost to the taxpayers, to the public, is going to be a billion plus over the long haul. And, it's now that's not unusual. If any of you or any of your listeners are sports fans, they know that, usually sports stadia are built with public money. This is probably among, if not the richest sort of public benefit of any sports stadium in football. But, I mean, certainly there's some pride in terms of Western New York in terms of having the bills. So is it unethical? No, I mean, it's certainly a problem legislatively because the governor's trying to use public money and jam it through the budget process and within the last week of 2 weeks of the budget process, which
Hmm.
creates angst, to put it mildly, among lawmakers because there's a fiscal tie to it. Um, Whether or not it's a good deal, of course, there's been no public debate. There's no hearings, none of that stuff that you normally would have in a functioning democracy. What makes it, of course, and you may be alluding to this, what makes it sort of a little trickier is the governor's husband is general counsel to a
Right.
company, Delaware North, which has the concession rights to the Bills Stadium. And so, how do you ensure that there was no, over coffee talk about that deal? They say there wasn't. There's no evidence that there was, but how do you know that for sure? And that's the tricky part. I mean, there's no meaningful sort of guidance for how that's supposed to happen, the relationship between the two of them. And, it's the modern world, right? Couples, both members of a couple can certainly have their own careers and stuff. And, the governor's husband went to Delaware North far before she became governor. So, it wasn't like this was all engineered. But there should be ethics guidance issued by the state's ethics watchdog, which has enforcement over that agreement and can therefore make it less likely that somebody would play any games. Right now, what the governor has done, nothing wrong with it, is to have a legal opinion written by one of her staff on how she's supposed to handle the Delaware North issues. But again, that's the subordinate of the governor issuing to the governor, which she should or shouldn't do. And while that's certainly a good thing, it's no substitute for meaningful ethics oversight by an independent agency. Now, she didn't do that. And so your question sort of is the obvious question that gets asked because there is no real rules of the road for her. And there should be.
So, do you think by me using the word unethical, do you think that's too strong of a word?
I think it's a word that I can't, it's hard to react to, right? I mean, it implies at best, I mean, at worst, it implies, it could be explicit, that you believe that something unethical happened. And we don't know that, I don't think.
Okay.
But it's certainly, the fact that people raise the question is a direct result of the fact that there's no opinion, enforceable opinion by the Joint Commission on Public Ethics on what she can and can't do. And, she was asked to do that. It wasn't like she didn't think of this. And she said, Jacob is a joke, and therefore I'm not going to even ask them. Now, she might be right on the first part, but that doesn't mean you don't go on the second part, because it is the agency that's supposed to give ethical guidance to public officials, and she didn't ask for it. And so there's always the sneaking suspicion that among members of the public that, well, what happened here?
So, Jacob was put in place by Cuomo, right?
Well, it was initiated by former Governor Cuomo, but of course it's a new law, right? So it was a deal with then Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver and then Senate Majority Leader Dean Skelos to create a new ethics watchdog when the new governor came in 2011, because the predecessor agency, the Commission on Public Integrity, had been so thoroughly discredited because of its poor performance and controversies of its own. So this was the new idea to sort of basically redo what was in place. And so it failed too. Yes, but there was the former governor's the advocacy that led to the creation of the new entity.
So, the other thing is the budget. We did not have an April 1st budget. Um, and Cuomo was pretty a stickler about getting it done by April 1st. When do you foresee the budget being passed?
Well, I mean, former governor said he was a stickler, but they wasn't true. The budgets were always late. They were just late in the beginning of April, not late in August. So The former governor, I mean, I don't even know what the number of budgets were. The last at least 3 or 4 budgets were all done in April. They were not done at the end of March. And so this is consistent with that. Um, I don't have a crystal ball in terms of what's going to happen. I mean, yesterday and, at the end here, it's sort of a roller coaster ride at the end about whether or not, you're going up to the top of the roller coaster and it's so exciting. And then you're screaming on the way down.
Mm.
It's sort of the same thing with the budget. Like, yesterday afternoon, it looked like they were going to have a deal. And last night they wasn't going to have a deal. And so it's not clear to me. I think the next real deadline is the end of this week. We'll see what happens.
So, what's it like during budget crunch for Blair Horner?
Well, it's been different, right? The last 2 budgets were done remotely. I wasn't allowed in the building. So that was different. The years before that were sort of scurrying around, trying to talk to legislators and lobbyists and staffers about particular issues that we have in the budget. But since we're a public interest organization, we have sort of a wide scope of things that we care about. And so this year is more like the pre-pandemic years, but not exactly. Members are really not on the floors. It's often difficult to get into their offices because of various COVID restrictions. So it's trickier, but I'm in the scurrying around the Capitol category as compared to the last 2 years, which was more, in the Zoom category of trying to influence policy.
Now, if you wanted to go see a specific senator or assembly person in the LOB, can you do that? Can you just walk into the LOB and go into their offices?
Well, you can walk into the LOB, and different offices have different restrictions. There are some that say you can't come in unless you set up an appointment. There are some that say you have to wear a mask. There's some that don't say anything. So it's not, at least my experience anyway, and everything can change because it's Albany, but it's been pretty much sort of left up to the individual office, I think, as to how they want to handle it. And so if you have a meeting with a legislator and you want to meet with them and they want to meet in their office, you can do it. You can still pick them off in the hallway as they're walking around. The committee meetings are still virtual, so you can't really go to hang around a committee meeting and talk to legislators. So it's certainly more restrictive than it was pre-pandemic, but it's certainly not as restrictive as it was in the last 2 years of the pandemic.
Do you think everything will go back to the way it was before?
No,
You don't.
no. The move toward use of remote technologies,
Yes.
virtual technology, Zoom, for example, or the various other products like it, I think they have a place now. And I think that is going to be increasingly, you can be much more efficient in terms of having meetings. You don't have to walk, for example, from office to office. Sometimes
Right.
it takes a long time. So I think that there will be some hybrid version, but I think eventually they will go, and they have to hopefully, knock on wood, the pandemic ends. I mean, who knows? The pandemic may never
Hmm.
end. But the pandemic, if it ends or eases to a point where we can handle it, I think they'll go back to meeting in person, but I think there'll be a lot more opportunity for them to vote remotely as compared to having to be in the chamber, for example, or having to be in the committees. I think that they're like in the olden days, when I was young, members would hang out in their offices and they were counted as yes votes if they weren't on the floor. And the only way you could be a no vote is if you showed up and changed your vote to a no. And they used to have in their offices something called the squawk box, which is where they could listen to the debates. And then if there was going to be a roll call vote, they could scurry over to the Capitol from their offices in the legislative office building. And that changed in the early aughts, where they were required to be in their seats, because after all, what's the point otherwise? So and now the system is more like it was in the Squawk Box days, except it's now Zoom instead of Squawk Box. So we'll see. We don't know exactly the future, but my guess is people are going to be reluctant to be cheek to jowl in any sort of settings over at the Capitol given that they're concerned about being sick. And just as a cautionary tale, the governor has reported that her top staff all had COVID at one point, and they're just
Mm-hmm.
coming back online, as she called it. So, you know, it's real. People still get sick. I had COVID in February, and so you know everybody still gets it, no matter how careful they are. Still got to be you got to be very careful. Wandering around the Capitol is not very careful.
So how ill were you?
Not ill at all.
Did you have a lot of symptoms or no?
Not really.
Really?
I had COVID light, as it turned out, but thankfully, right. But I know people who've had it around the same time I did when they were very sick. So it must be the dosage that I was exposed to or whatever. I mean, who knows, right? But it was. I mean, Omicron, as we all know, is not nearly as deadly as some of its predecessors.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't know what the future holds.
This is true. This is very true. So what can people expect? You know, the session is going to end in June, but then the campaign season starts. What can people expect over the next few months?
Well, I think, assuming that the budget gets wrapped up this week, which, is just that an assumption. There's no clear evidence that that's going to be the case. They'll take a break. They'll be back at the end of the month. And they're really only working through Memorial Day. Technically, their last day is June 2nd, and they all hit the campaign trail for the
Wow.
primaries in June. Unless, again, the redistricting decision changes all that. So I think it's going to be pretty hectic politically. I think the Democrats are running hard because they're worried about the situation. I mean, President Biden's unpopularity, I think, hurts them in New York. And, the public's unhappy with, inflation and crime. And they're, I think Democrats are going to be concerned about, how that impacts their running for office. So I think it's going to be a very contentious, competitive, partisan environment between when the budget gets done and when the election occurs in November. I think we're in for 6 months of slugging it out.
So there's been rumors and talk about Cuomo re-entering the arena. From the conversations that you've had and what you've seen, do you think he's gonna make an appearance in 2022 or he's gonna ride it out?
No, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to predict what goes on between the ears of Andrew Cuomo, right? So it's sort of, who knows, right? I mean, he's entitled to do whatever he wants to do. And because of these dumb decisions, he's allowed to keep the $18 million to spend as he sees fit. And right now, he's paying lawyers to sue Jayco, I assume, with his campaign contributions,
Mm-hmm.
which is sort of crazy, right? I mean, that's not what they should be used for, but he can. And so he controls essentially the biggest political action committee in the state. If he wants to use it to run for office, he will. I don't know if it makes sense to do it. That's a different question.
Mm-hmm.
But he may sense an opportunity. And despite all of his failings, he's a very shrewd political operator. And that doesn't mean he doesn't make mistakes. 2002, for example, he had an ill-fated campaign for governor.
Right.
But he does have pretty good skills when it comes to being a politician. And if he senses an opportunity, he may choose to take it.
So, from your perspective, is being a political junkie in New York State fun?
By implication, that means me. Um, yes, I'm fascinated by how, I mean, our society is a rules-based society. However, imperfectly, we have rules and apply them. But we are a rules-based society. And if you want to change things, you change the rules. And so it's always fascinating to me how that process plays out. I mean, I just love it. And a student of the game is for many years. And it's an important activity. Democracy is an important activity, and it's a work in progress. It never gets any better. I mean, I'm sorry, it does get better, but it never gets perfect. And, that's like the rest of humankind. It's filled with
That's
human
right.
beings. It'll never be perfect.
So, we have a couple of minutes left. Why don't you give your contact information if somebody wants to contact NYPIRG or become involved with NYPIRG?
Well, thank you for asking. The easiest way to do it is to just go to our website, which is www.nypirg.org, nypirg.org. It stands for New York Public Interest Research Group. And so when you go there, it's chock full of stuff. There's free stuff, like you can check online for unregulated contaminants in drinking water supplies and just type in your zip code and find out. We have services where we help people give them free non-legal services to help them go to small claims court, for example. And we have advocacy information. We have a way for people to sign up and be part of our community action network, which is sort of our grassroots involvement wing of NYPIRG. So there's lots of different kinds of things you can do. And nypirg.org is the way to do it.
Blair, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me and focus on Albany. I know you must be really hectic busy, right?
It's a busy day.
So thank you, Blair. You have a wonderful day. And thank
Great.
you,
Thank you.
everybody, for listening. Thanks, Blair.
Take care, Cynthia.
Talk soon.